Hi, this is Joseph Cadotte and Elizabeth. What do you want to go by this time?
You know what? For artistic purposes, Elizabeth Kidder.
Elizabeth Kidder, we're basically old sins if you add in my wife, and today we're talking about abortion.
Oh, please don't.
No, actually,
no. You sold me a false bill of goods, sir. That is not
we're
what you
going
said.
to talk about when and how to kill your characters.
Oh, something even better. Excellent.
Yes. So, I have my opinions. Let's see what you have.
Okay. In my writing, I tend to kill off very few characters. But I find it more so that the story arcs I'm telling don't really require the character to die in order to gain some greater insight into who they were. Very few sacrificial lambs in my book. But I do remember that when I was a kid, the idea of conflict scared me to no end. Every time I watched a movie or read a book, I'm like, but why couldn't they have just been all happy for 3 hours and got along together? And why does it have to be a conflict? I hate it when they're put to the test. And that was something I had to grow way out of when I started writing, because you have to put them through something, otherwise they don't do anything.
There's actually an obscure and hopefully defunct feminist theory of writing that held minor sway in the mid-90s that I was exposed to when I was in an MFA program, where conflict and climax were supposed to be ignored and forbidden. Apparently that was a male way of writing. I don't know what that says about the people who formulated it or what it says about me, because I think that that's complete rubbish. But
it's weird to think that we have to separate ourselves. It's sort of a separate but not equal sort of thing. Even if it's a better way of telling a story, even if it was a better way of telling a story.
Which I think it isn't, frankly.
Weird that only women get to do that. Only men get to do big, bombastic, like, well, why wouldn't you want to share it with more people? Why is it only this way then? And if so, then Jane Austen wrote a bunch of terrible books, because all of them have some sort of climax or conflict.
Yeah.
And I would consider her one of the great feminist authors of her time.
Oh, no, she wasn't. You see, there were men in the books, too. You guys may think I'm exaggerating, but these are actually theories that I studied when I was in grad school and in my undergrad. There were all sorts of theories like this going around. If you want to look up a bunch of crazy, I recommend reading Andrea Dworkin. So, yeah. And we had Catherine McKinnon on campus at the University of Michigan, who was married.
Yeah.
Supposedly happily. But anyways, that was the 90s. You think things are bad now? It was worse. So, but go ahead, continue.
But death. So for me, I really got into the idea of, if my character has to grow and they have to be motivated, death has to be so super critically important to the character that it's happening to, not just to fuel someone else's motivation. I'm very anti-fridging in any respect of the word. Another character's death cannot be solely for the use of our main protagonist to grow. And I think it's weak. It feels like a weak trope to me to say, oh, I killed off your wife and daughter, and now you will join me in destroying the universe, just to name X-Men Apocalypse, which for some reason was in my head. I don't know why. But it has to be for the character's benefit. And as far as death goes, I'm much more into it in the D&D campaign than I am in writing my own stories, because I love my babies too much.
Yes.
But my players are expendable, please.
Well, of course. They only put hours and hours into creating and developing these people who are their own alter egos and expressions of their truest desires. So, yeah, you can go ahead and kill them whenever.
I jest, but I have not yet, in my very limited capacity as a D&D game master, I have not yet killed off any of the people who are playing. I find it that it feels lazy to me that you couldn't, as the ruler of this universe, come up with a pleasing way to engage the story further without just saying, oh, well, you turned the wrong way and went down a 50-foot rabbit hole and now you are dead. Okay, bye. Like, well, it's not a story arc fulfilling. It's not, you've reached a peak and here's what had to happen. I do like the idea of death only to come back, very Marvel superhero-esque, to you fell off the edge of this cliff and we'll come back to you later. You're dead right now. We're gonna talk to the rest of these guys, and later, and then he returned. I'm like, well, that's cool. It's fun. I don't like it in the MCU so much, but I do like it in TNT.
So the cliffhanger, sort of.
Like a literal cliffhanger, yeah. Just the idea that because it's interactive storytelling, that the player is still there in the room, and you've just thrown them there, and now they're like, I am in limbo. It's like a second level of storytelling. Now they're thinking, what do I do? How did I get into this? How am I going to get out of this? I'm here now in death. And that's kind of like how when you are down to 0, you're not actually dead. You could still make it. Mm-hmm. If someone gets over there and if someone gets over there and helps you, but otherwise, just fade away.
Yeah. Well, for me, I think that in both writing and in game mastering, death for any important character needs to be as a result of the character's decisions. Okay, you can't. I completely agree with you on fridging, and I don't like random death just to prove that anybody can die. And I'm looking at you, Walking Dead.
I was gonna
hack of a story.
I was gonna Game of Thrones in the other corner, but
yeah,
also Walking Dead.
That is not a sufficient reason to develop a character, present them to the reader or player, and then kill them, is to show peril. That's like how it's what's called the Worf effect on TV tropes, where as soon as someone shows up on the Next Generation's bridge, you have them beat up Worf to show that they're strong. First off, it makes Worf less of a character, which is a reliable threat, because if like every episode someone's beating the crap out of Worf, he's not he's not the measure. And second, that doesn't really develop their character. You might as well just say this guy's strong. It's become a trope or an event that is a shorthand, and those are useful things, but they're not original. They're not necessarily useful beyond just establishing peril. If you want to establish peril, put your characters in peril where they can make a stupid decision, which would be in keeping with what they would normally do, and kill them off that way if you need to kill them off. I don't like killing off characters. I do it. But I feel like as a author, it is my responsibility to create characters that can survive, or at the very least die in productive and interesting ways to the story as a whole. Mm-hmm. And since story derives from character, then that means that their death needs to be derived from their own actions and their psyche.
Yeah, one of the great deaths that I like to, if I were to, I would want this to be the one that I would think of most, is the death of Boromir in Lord of the Rings. Mm-hmm. I like it because he starts off thinking he knows what is best, so proud, son of man, and then slowly falls to his temptation to sin or the ring, further and further to his own psyche, going madder and madder with power until he realizes what he's done. And in the end, his death is noble, not because it's death, but because he made the choice to come back and sacrifice at any cost to save those he swore to protect. And it's noble. It's not, and he, in his actions, makes sense for the arc that is created for him. His death is the natural progression and end result of his arc. And it's not just death to make everyone else in the story feel bad. He got to go home. He was called home. Like, that was the arc that he needed to go on to be a better person. Would I wanted him to live? Yeah, but I think it might have actually cheapened the whole arc that he had getting there.
Yeah. And there is a redemption aspect to some deaths. Darth Vader is the most obvious one, where after being a little weasel his entire life, and then Anakin finally makes a decision which isn't centered on himself, and I think that does in fact redeem him to some extent. And
hard to redeem the space equivalent of Hitler,
but he's not the space equivalent.
Well, yeah,
of
the
Hitler.
Emperor is more of the
See, I don't even know if that's an accurate representation, because there's a lot of problems with the old Republic.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the other day, the new Galaxy's Edge opened up in Disney, and I was just looking at the pictures and I'm like, boy, this looks like Star Wars, But all that reminds me of is that it's a really shitty universe, Star Wars' universe. No one gets off scot-free. Everyone's in some sort of peril or death. Even if you're a cool, kicky ninja with a light sword, you still get either taken out like a punk, or you end up turning to the dark side, or no one gets out of this thing scot-free. It's a really bleak and depressing universe to live in when you take away the kicky flips.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I think Star Wars has a lot to say over Star Trek simply because it does have the fact that it is a morally gray universe. And whereas Star Trek is ostensibly morally white, even though if you look at it, it's morally black. And
you wouldn't, for a first reading of Star Wars and Star Trek, you would not think that true at all.
In fact, you would think the reverse is true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, when it comes to characters and players, if a player makes a decision, or a character in my mind makes a decision, because as writers, we know that characters have autonomy, even if we like to think that we created them. I'm not saying they're independent of us, but some aspect of us is forcing them in one path or another.
My characters constantly surprise me.
Yes, exactly. So when they make a decision that is in character and perilous, that's an acceptable death. If it's rocks fall, everybody dies, that is not an acceptable death.
It's the equivalent of a quick time event in a video game.
Yes, and those... Well, that's not part of the discussion.
That's neither here nor there. But the idea that if you weren't quick enough to somehow see something you couldn't have seen coming in the tale of this cinematic that another person is telling you, and then you just die, like, well, that was a very unsatisfying ending you've just given me.
Yes, and the reason why QuickTime events work is because you can go back and do it again.
Yeah.
But
imagine a book went that way. I mean, they're called Choose Your Own Adventure books, and you died in the Yeti's lair, surrounded by frostbite. Try again.
Yes, which is fine for that sort of genre. And then there are other more esoteric works that do the same sort of thing. And there are good movies, Groundhog's Day, and from what I understand, although I've not seen them and need to, Happy Death Day and Edge of Tomorrow are both very good that do the same sort of thing.
I liked Edge of Tomorrow. Yeah, I'm not a Tom Cruise fan at all, but I liked the idea of it, and it's more than anything, it was just fascinating, the idea that this movie was pretty cool, but it was marketed so terribly that the thing just bombed, and it was fine.
Or Dark City is another very good one. I highly recommend that one to anybody who wants to build campaigns.
Or who likes The Matrix.
Yes, a better version. But you know, and I think that this also applies to MOOCs as well, the anonymous cannon fodder. First off, I hate the idea of anonymous cannon fodder. In my most recent book, I actually kill off 50,000 people. You don't remember this?
Oh, so, okay, yeah, so I was wondering if that was the exact number, because that's a lot more than I had gathered from the...
Off-scene. But the reason why I do it is because it's to parallel an actual historic event. And therefore, that's where that number comes from.
Well, that's tricky to, the idea that, most historical events happen in an not in a narrative way. Bad things happen. And the whole point of life is trying to make some sense out of senseless things.
I wouldn't say that's the point of life, but that's outside the scope of this.
A facet of humanity, I would say, is trying to make sense of senseless things. And when things like 6 million people die in concentration camps, we then have to, what was the sense? And then we have the Nuremberg trials. We realize, oh, you were all just following orders, and there is no actual evil guy. It's just...
Oh, yeah, there are.
Yeah, but it's just people too afraid. Say, well, that was the rules. I have to.
It's on the order of 12 million. People always forget the gypsies, the Slavs, the gays, the...
anyone who wasn't a
elderly. Yeah. Yeah, pretty much. So, anyways, not to minimize the impact on the Jewish people, but but yeah, the character is based on someone who actually did this and did this off screen. In other words, he ordered it done, and he knew what he was doing
to show the might of his power.
Yes,
what he was going to.
Kind of. That was kind of, yes. So therefore I kind of had to do that. And that was a difficult decision because I was doing my best to keep this theme going that of this character's arc to mirror these historic characters, but I also hate the idea of just, as I said, killing people off to kill people off, you know, and I hate this in when I'm playing the games. I make it very clear to my players that the goblins are not necessarily evil. You know, orcs are not necessarily evil, unlike Tolkien, who totally wussed out on that one. You know.
I like the idea that it's not always black and white. That the idea is that it challenges, your players are challenged when a character walks through them and they have to decide, how are we going to approach this character who looks this way? How would I, in real life, how would my character address this person who appears threatening but may not be, or appears non-threatening but could absolutely be an assassin or something?
Yeah, and so, I mean, if someone is an assassin, there's a legit reason to kill them off. It's self-defense. On the other hand, you have to give them the opportunity to question them or so on. You can't just like have them have a suicide pill when they get caught. Because first off, the story ends right there with that assassin, you know.
Yeah. That was just a device then.
It was a device.
Character.
And I think that this fundamentally is where you get to. If you're killing somebody off, not for the purposes of their own character development, okay, yes, it ends at that point usually, depending. My D&D world, there's reincarnation, so it doesn't end at that point. But when you kill somebody off for any other reason than their own character development, I feel that they are functioning as a prop. And I do not like characters to function as props, because people are not props. And dolls, which is what these are, representations of people, should not be used as props either. In this case, if there is some sort of affinity with them. And this is one of the big problems I have with a lot of media that happened from the 70s on, especially during the grimdark edgelord days of the 90s.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Oh, anybody can die. Well, that means that death doesn't really have much value.
It's meaningless.
Everybody knows that anybody can die. The question is, how do you live?
Yeah.
So,
that was very profound right there. The question is, how do you... I liked it. That was good.
Okay.
I'm going to steal that for a future book.
Good. Is there? Do you want to finish this off?
Okay. I will say that in much the same way that leading a D&D campaign can be like corralling a herd of cats, much the same way it can be said about writing, because sometimes your characters are going to do something stupid, and I find it, as long as it's within character, I find it unfair to penalize them for a mistake, especially if it can lead to character development. So you can't say just because they made this one bad mistake that they can never recover from it. It just doesn't have a good redeeming arc in real life or in your story. So if you have to kill, and sometimes you have to kill, we've established that it has to be because of their own choice, because of their own arc, and that they are allowed to make a mistake, and they don't maybe have to die right then that day if they can die another day.
Yeah. So, and with that, shout out to a James Bond film, and not a bad song, I'm going to insist. Let's end this.